I'm going to actually let you take it away. So periodization, like what the fuck does that even mean?
So periodization fundamentally can be thought of as how you organize your programming over time, okay, or your training over time. So you can think of kind of programming overall or training overall in two different ways. One, you can think of it at a static moment in time. What does your program look like? What do you do? And then you want to ask yourself, okay, and how does that change over time? Okay, very simple way of looking at things. And in some cases, this is really important. And a lot of the discussions around periodization, or a lot of the research into periodization and different periodization methodologies, would have emerged from Olympic sports in particular, for the very simple reason that if you're doing an Olympic sport, you've got a very large macro cycle of a 4-year period, across which you have to organize your training. Then you can break down you can break down those 4-year blocks into different mesocycles, which, like, let's say it might be a 3-month period of time where you're focused primarily on strength development or something. And then you might have a microcycle, which could be, the single session or the week or the month, depending on who you're consulting while reading about periodization. But overall, you can see that there might be some sort of logic there for an Olympic sport, because if you're very far out from your Olympic competition, you might be, developing your general fitness qualities. You might be troubleshooting from previous competitions what your areas of weakness are, etc. But then once it gets closer to competition, it's very, very specific to the upcoming events. Similarly, if you're a team sport athlete, you might view periodization or long-term training planning in accordance with the sporting season. So, for example, if you have a sport that has a kind of spring to autumn season, and then you take a break from September or October to February or March or something like that, then that period of the off season might be viewed in your long-term training plan as a period where you gain a bit of weight, you focus on improving your overall maximal muscular strength, maybe laying down a bit of muscle mass, increasing strength in areas that are potentially higher or more susceptible to injury in your sport, and eventually then getting back to the more sport specific stuff of skill development, maximal speed, explosiveness, etc. So overall, again, there you can see that there's some sort of logic. However,
Just on that,
go
like,
ahead.
this is like, why would you even be looking at that? Like, can we not just develop all of these characteristics at once? Like, surely that's what we can do, no?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it is possible, to be fair, and to some degree, for the kind of average person, the kind of casual gym goer, that's actually fine. An example of that would be people who are like training martial arts, like, to stick with something we're familiar with. If you're training Brazilian jiu-jitsu, let's say, a lot of people get into jiu-jitsu with the kind of vision of, yeah, someday I'll get my black belt. That might be in 15 years. I don't care if it's in 10 years or 20 years. I'll get there eventually. I'm just going to, yeah, I'm just going to keep showing up. That's kind of the vision people have. Some people take it very seriously competitively, but most people don't. Most people are like, I'm just going to keep showing up and trying to get better. I work a job during the day, and I like having something to work at from a sporting perspective and a martial arts perspective. And if you take that into account, then what a lot of people will do is, over the years, they'll simultaneously focus on, right, I want to get a bit stronger. I want to build a bit of muscle. I want to improve my fitness. And you can kind of do all those things simultaneously because you don't really have set deadlines as such. Okay. There's no time pressure on you. But when you're a sporting athlete, for example, the field sport athlete, GAA athlete, let's say, as you come towards the more intense phase of a season, let's say you're doing 2 to 3 or more in some sports, especially professional sports, sport specific sessions per week that are becoming increasingly intense with a lot more speed work, a lot more high intensity, let's say repeated sprints or whatever. And then you've got your match on the weekend. then now there's actually a number of things that are stopping you from training in the way that you would have to if you're trying to build maximal strength. So for example, if you have a match on the weekend, or maybe even two matches for people who play two different sports, which isn't uncommon in Ireland, where a lot of people would play Gaelic football and hurling, or they might play Gaelic football and soccer if they're younger. If you're that type of individual, you're kind of already in a position where training the lower body from Friday to Monday, it's gonna be really difficult, because your legs are either going to be in a position where you need them to be fresh for the game, or they're tired from the game. So you've got these barriers in the way of you being able to develop these fitness qualities to the best degree. In addition to that, if you were trying to train maximal speed or really build up your engine from an aerobic fitness perspective or anaerobic fitness perspective, that's going to take a lot out of you, and you mightn't be able to develop that to the best you could if you have to go and play a game at the weekend. So this is kind of one of the reasons that this is of a greater importance for athletes who actually have, time pressure, deadlines, matches, etc. And
just on that as well, like this is one of the hard things about like Gaelic football, where like they basically don't really have seasons, like they say they do, but if you're in like going for championship, the better you do, the longer your season is. Yeah. And it could be like basically everyone else is starting again, where you're still, you got 2 weeks off, so you don't have as much of a season. And it's kind of the same with, like different martial arts, like boxing, for example, or again, like jujitsu, you don't really have a season. Like, it's not like this is a competitive season. This is, my off season, and as a result of that, like you kind of can't periodize as much when you're going for those kind of sports, like obviously, if you do have distinct periods of time, and people naturally periodize, and like we will get into this, I'm just interrupting, jumping ahead. But like people naturally periodize their training, their nutrition, their different whatever stuff. Like say you're coming up to summer, people will be like, oh, I actually want to lean out a little bit. That's kind of my focus. And you might, change your training around that. Versus like it's coming into winter now, you might be like, oh, I'm just going to get bigger. I'm going to really focus on, I don't really care if I gain more body fat. I'm going to, tailor my training to really focus on getting stronger or bigger or whatever. Right. So like people do naturally fall into these like periodization cycles or whatever, but just keeping it with the sporting context, it really does depend on like what your sport is, what the season of the sport is, and then how you then view periodization. Because if we're talking about, which we are talking about, resistance training, or we'll call them strength sports, right? Like a lot of the research on this has been influenced, well, by two things. First of all, a lot of it's been influenced by the fact that we're dealing with, previously at least, sports that had a 4-year cycle, right? Like if you look at any like the 1970s literature, it's all about like, oh, how we periodize for the Olympics. Like it's basically just talking about the Olympics. And the other thing that people weren't really counting on at that time was, and this is the other thing I was talking about, is that a lot of that research is done, or I say research, a lot of those practical things were done to maximize the drugs that were being used. So that's an unfortunate beginning to all of this stuff, because I say beginning because like obviously people did periodize their training beforehand. Like you can go back to like ancient Greece and stuff, like the start of the Olympics, like people would periodize their training as a result of that. Like they had during the Olympics in Greece, they had like during the month of the Olympics, they had a truce. Like, so all the different city states and all the different municipalities or whatever you want to call them would have a truce. So even if there was an ongoing war, like you could travel freely to go to compete in the Olympics, but I say that because they would also do stuff like, the 3 months before that, they would start feeding the athletes that are going to compete, like from the different provinces and whatever, they would feed them more protein, right? Because they realized, if you get more protein, you actually are a bit stronger, maybe a little bit more muscle coming up to the Olympics. Like you want to get that, prestige and whatever else, So like periodization is not a new concept, but the science and stuff, it's kind of really, we'll say the 70s that it comes from. And as a result of that, it's kind of heavily influenced by the modern conception of the Olympics, like that every 4-year cycle, which is not modern, but you know what I mean? And then also drugs, unfortunately.
Yeah. And to give a kind of a personal example of, like, let's say with COVID in the last 18 months to 2 years, one of the things that happened was that a lot of people had kind of forced periodization on themselves. or it was enforced upon them. So, for example, with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in particular, or any martial arts really, like we basically couldn't train for longer than most other sports because of the nature of the close contact. So what I did earlier this year was I actually spent a good bit of time doing a lot more strength work than I had for quite a while. People, if you're following me on Instagram, you'll have seen me posting, more deadlift videos, more squat videos, etc., more maximal strength stuff than I had done for a long time. But now that we're back to more intensive training and jiu-jitsu is kind of open as normal, effectively, I'm actually not prioritizing that as much anymore. And even if I have a really busy week with jiu-jitsu and I only get 2 or 3 strength sessions in, and even if they're not particularly close to max effort, that's actually fine for me, because when I run the analysis on the fitness qualities that I need to improve, if jiu-jitsu is my goal, then skill is the primary thing that's actually going to hold me back more than anything else, because I've done the strength and conditioning thing for whatever, a decade, and so I've laid that base of, like, for my weight with strength and fitness and flexibility and everything. Those fitness qualities are actually pretty much nailed. So it's really about bringing up the skill for me. However, for many other people who, let's say, got into jiu-jitsu without that background of strength and fitness, that actually might be what limits them, because, like, in a sport like jiu-jitsu where it's quite technical, the more fatigued you are, the less well you're going to be able to execute the skill. So you might have great skill when you're fresh, but if you're super, super fatigued after 2 minutes, you're not going to be able to execute on that. So that, I guess, is a personal example of where periodization might become more relevant, where I'm going to focus more on that when we are not able to train, but I just don't have to prioritize it as much when training at full capacity. So as a result, I can, let's say, focus on getting 4 to 6 jiu-jitsu sessions in, whereas for someone else, it might be a better use of their time early on to do 3 to 4 and then allocate that extra time to their strength and their conditioning work. So
this just goes back to that initial episode we did of series, where it's like, what are your goals? Like, you actually have to sit down and be like, what am I actually training towards? Because myself and Gary, like, we're in a very similar position. Like, I've literally, what age did I start training? Like 15 or something, right? 16 maybe. So, like, I've been training for 15 years. Like, I'm nearly 30. I'm 30 in January, right? So I've been training for now 15 years. So, like, in my weight class, which is the heaviest weight class we can be in, just putting that out there, like, I'm already stronger than everyone else. Like, it's going to be rare that I'm going to come against someone that is stronger than me. So if I'm at the very top end of that, like, strength range, like, do I need to be, doing max efforts? Do I need to be like, I need to really push the boundaries with strength? No, I probably don't. It's not going to be the limiting factor for me, right? For me, again, it's still going to be that skill component, and it's also, for me, I want to get fucking bigger. Like, I'm not at the top end. Like, I'm in that top end. That's why I brought it up. I wasn't just being a dickhead. But I'm in that, top weight class, but I'm not at the top end of that weight class. I'm at the bottom end of it, right? So for me, I'm going to spend more time, focusing on building some muscle. I want to be like, right, like, the top end of the weight class is like 120 or whatever. I'm not going to get up to there, but I'm like, let's see how far we can get into this so that I can be as competitive as possible with no actual goals to compete. You know what I mean? So, like, for me, like, even though me and Gary are, very similar position, we're just like, okay, we're both training jiu-jitsu. We both have a background in resistance training, cardio, whatever you want to call all this stuff. We're both at a skill deficit, but our goals are still different in terms of, like, what's our focus. Like, Gary right now, because I'm a blue belt, I'm just far more skillful than Gary, yourself. He's a lowly white belt. So for him, like, he needs to focus more on skill. For me, yeah, it's just second nature, I just need to get bigger, right? So, like, even though our goals are very similar, they start to diverge a little bit. And that's the kind of needs analysis you kind of need to do for yourself. You're like, well, what am I actually trying to do? And then we can start layering on all this other stuff that we've discussed. And then we can start periodizing a plan over time, because, like, I'm not going to be always focusing on getting bigger. Well, I probably am, because I want to get fucking jacked. But you know what I mean? Like, I'm not always going to be like, right, it's all about getting bigger. It's all about calorie surplus, blah, blah, blah. There's going to be times where I'm like, I actually want to pull back a little bit. I, gain too much body fat. And that's periodizing, we'll say, the body composition aspect, the nutrition aspect, but that also aligns with the training aspect, which is more so what we're talking about here. Anyway, that was a little bit of a tangent. So continue, Gary.
Yes, and for clarity, I think here it is important. It's important to note that just because we're saying this, it doesn't mean that we're saying we would not benefit from getting stronger or getting fitter or getting more flexible or whatever. It's just that we're closer to topping those out, you know. So it's like on FIFA or Minecraft or RuneScape or whatever, where you've got, you know, your certain characters. I don't think they actually do this on Minecraft. That's a mistake. But where you've got, like, let's say I'm 95 strength, I've got 91 agility, and then with, in this case, it might be we've got 21 skill, you know. So let's focus on trying to level that up. So you need to do that with respect to your own training, which goes back to the earlier episodes in this podcast, so I won't touch on that anymore. Focus on going back and running your needs analysis on your training. But the thing is, all those different things we've just discussed, we're kind of assuming that people are doing activities that require multiple different components of fitness that they have to bring up. But that's actually not the case for many listeners. Most listeners are listening to this because they want to get in better shape, they want to get a bit stronger, and they want to build a bit of muscle, maybe. Okay.
Or they want to do that for their clients.
Or they want to do that for the clients. And the reality is that's most personal training clients. So if you're a personal trainer listening to this, even if you're interested in strength conditioning for athletes, or you know, you want to work with those types of people, that's just not your average personal training client. And focusing on, you know, complex periodization models for people who are interested in body composition, it doesn't really matter. And I'll caveat that, but I'll just say that it doesn't really matter. Okay, I'll add my caveat.
Also, I would even say like the literature would probably support that. You know,
Yes.
the literature is actually quite weak for periodization in general. Like even with all the stuff that we've been talking about, you know.
Yeah.
So if you then put it into this other realm where it's like, you know, it's just body composition really that we're chasing, some health markers maybe. You know, it's very, very under supported. Underwhelming is the word I would use to say, you know, oh, how well does the literature support periodization for average Joe or Jane? I'd be like, very, very poorly. It's not great.